October 1962. The world teetered on the edge of annihilation. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had been escalating for years. The Cold War was no longer a distant political struggle. It was a global standoff with the threat of nuclear war looming over every decision. Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast, became the focal point. After Fidel Castro seized power in 1959 and aligned with the USSR, Washington feared a hostile nuclear presence in the Western Hemisphere. The Soviets, under Nikita Khrushchev, secretly began shipping medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles to Cuba. Their aim, to balance the strategic advantage that the United States enjoyed with its missiles in Turkey and Italy. The Americans, unaware at first, relied on conventional intelligence reports and spy networks that struggled to confirm the Soviet buildup. By early October 1962, U.S. intelligence had begun to piece together the pattern. Reconnaissance flights over Cuba hinted at construction, sites and military activity, but what was being built remained uncertain. The stakes could not have been higher. If these were nuclear missile sites, the U.S. would face the unprecedented reality of a direct, short-range nuclear threat on its doorstep. President John F. Kennedy was briefed. The gravity of the situation became clear. A misstep could trigger a confrontation that might engulf the world in nuclear fire. Advisors debated options, weighing risk, legality, and the potential for catastrophic escalation. Every hour mattered. Every decision carried weight that could alter history. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Khrushchev calculated that Cuba could be a decisive bargaining chip. He understood that the deployment could counterbalance American missiles in Europe, but also that discovery could provoke a crisis. The pieces were moving into place, and the world stood unknowingly on the brink. One discovery would ignite 13 days that could have ended human civilization. October 14, 1962, a U-2 reconnaissance plane soared over Cuba and captured the images that would change the world. The photographs revealed Soviet missile installations under construction. These were not ordinary weapons. They were nuclear-capable, missiles capable of striking much of the continental United States within minutes. The intelligence was irrefutable. President Kennedy and his advisors faced a chilling reality. The balance of nuclear power had shifted overnight. The White House convened a series of emergency meetings, later known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. Military planners presented options ranging from a surgical airstrike to a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Diplomatic channels were considered, but the clock was ticking. Every day that the missiles remained operational increased the risk of a direct nuclear confrontation. The discovery also sent shockwaves through the American public once it became known. Fear, anxiety, and tension escalated, though the full details remained classified. For Kennedy, the challenge was both political and moral. How to remove the threat without triggering a nuclear war. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev calculated that the U.S. might accept the presence of missiles in Cuba if it preserved global stability, but he also understood the risk of confrontation. Both leaders faced the ultimate question: how to demonstrate resolve without annihilating humanity. The images of missile launches, construction equipment, and Soviet troops in Cuba became the starting point for a tense negotiation. Intelligence briefings painted a stark picture. The next 2 weeks could define the survival of millions, if not billions. The world had seconds to breathe, but the clock was ticking toward nuclear catastrophe. The next hours would define history. Every option carried risk. Inside the White House, debates raged. Military advisors advocated for immediate airstrikes to destroy the missile sites, followed by a possible invasion. Others warned that such action would almost certainly provoke a Soviet retaliation, possibly escalating to full-scale nuclear war. Kennedy sought a measured approach, strength without rashness. The alternative emerged, a naval blockade, officially termed a quarantine, to prevent further Soviet shipments of missiles to Cuba. This middle ground solution demonstrated resolve while buying time for diplomacy. Meanwhile, Kennedy authorized covert communications with Moscow, seeking a path to avoid confrontation while asserting American security interests. The decision was political, military, and ethical. Kennedy had to maintain credibility with the American public, reassure NATO allies, and avoid a global disaster. EXCOM meetings were tense, often extending into late nights, as every scenario was modeled for its potential consequences. At the same time, back-channel communications began. Advisors and intermediaries explored options that could allow Khrushchev to withdraw without losing face. Both sides understood that miscalculation could trigger the ultimate catastrophe: nuclear war. As the blockade began, American forces were placed on DEFCON 2, the highest state of readiness since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet ships approached the quarantine line, testing the resolve of U.S. naval forces. The world held its collective breath. Every hour, every decision, every message carried the weight of potential annihilation. October 1628, 1962, 13 days that defined the Cold War. The world watched silently as diplomacy, espionage, and military posturing converged in the Caribbean. Secret letters and back-channel negotiations became lifelines for survival. Khrushchev proposed public removal of missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. Secretly, he also demanded the withdrawal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. Tense negotiations unfolded. Kennedy and his advisors weighed each message carefully. Publicly, the blockade and statements of resolve projected American strength. Privately, concessions and careful diplomacy allowed both sides to save face. The world remained unaware of just how close humanity had come to the edge. At one point, U-2 reconnaissance flights and Soviet responses brought forces to DEFCON 2 readiness. Military leaders prepared for a nuclear exchange that could destroy cities on both continents. The stakes were nothing less than global survival. Ultimately, the crisis was diffused. Khrushchev agreed to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba, and Kennedy publicly pledged not to invade the island. Secretly, the U.S. also agreed to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey within months, satisfying Soviet security concerns. The 13 days ended, but the lessons endured. The world had glimpsed the brink of nuclear war and survived, not by chance, but by a combination of intelligence, diplomacy, and restraint. 13 days had shaken the planet to its core, proving the terrifying reality of nuclear brinkmanship. The Cuban Missile Crisis left an indelible mark on history. For Kennedy, the crisis was a triumph of measured leadership. The world had seen the power of nuclear brinkmanship and the importance of diplomacy backed by credible force. His administration immediately took steps to establish direct communication with the Kremlin, the famous hotline between Washington and Moscow, designed to prevent future misunderstandings. For Khrushchev, the crisis was a lesson in the limits of confrontation. While he maintained Soviet influence in Cuba, the near catastrophe demonstrated the dangers of miscalculation. Both superpowers recognized that nuclear weapons were not tools for victory. They were instruments of mutual destruction. Globally, the crisis reshaped Cold War strategy. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, became central. Intelligence, reconnaissance, and communication assumed unprecedented importance. Armies, scientists, and diplomats learned that restraint, timing, and subtle negotiation were as vital as military strength. The Cuban Missile Crisis also left a moral imprint. Humanity had faced the reality of nuclear war and survived by a delicate balance of fear, strategy, and leadership. Future crises, Berlin, Vietnam, and the Middle East, would all be informed by these lessons. Ultimately, the 13 days proved that in the nuclear age, survival depended not only on weapons but on the wisdom and judgment of those who wielded power. The Cold War would continue, but the Cuban Missile Crisis remained a defining moment, a stark reminder of how close the world had come to annihilation. The edge of disaster had been skirted. The lessons of Cuba would echo through decades, shaping the world in the shadow of nuclear weapons.